Welcome to Uncle Da's Financial Wisdom Diary, a finance reading channel that hopes every follower can become wealthier. Recently, I've fallen in love with studying political economy. A lot of people ask, what's the point of studying this? I think reading political economy can help you see through the social operating logic behind wages and tax policies. So you won't be fooled by appearances when it comes to matters involving your wallet and life choices. So you can keep things straight and see what's really going on. So, after Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, let's do a close read of another heavyweight classic, Principles of Political Economy, written 170 years ago. The author, John Stuart Mill, was the great synthesizer of 19th-century British classical economics, and at the same time a philosopher and social thinker. All right, without further ado, let's get to the point. First, let me ask 3 questions you've most likely wrestled with over and over while working late at night to check your pay stub and scrolling through industry news. First, office workers do a 9-to-5 or even 9-9-6, spending their whole lives revolving around their wages. Is there really no other way to live besides working for a boss in exchange for an income? That makes more sense. Second, on your pay stub, personal income tax and Social Security are automatically deducted. And in everyday spending, consumption tax is quietly hidden in the price. Money slips out of your wallet without a sound. By what standard, exactly, should it be collected, and how much counts as truly fair? Third, from industry regulation to market rules, policies tighten for a while, then loosen again. Which things, exactly, are the government obligated to manage? And which are overstepping, pointless meddling? So where, exactly, is the boundary drawn? These real-world challenges that trouble people today. John Stuart Mill already laid out the underlying logic clearly as far back as 170 years ago in his Principles of Political Economy. As the pinnacle figure of classical economics, Mill is a universally recognized prodigy in history. He studied Greek at the age of 3 and was fluent in Latin by 8. As a teenager, he had already read through the works of Adam Smith and Ricardo. As an adult, he moved between academia and public affairs. He neither blindly took the capitalist side and championed complete laissez-faire, nor agreed with extreme socialism's denial of the market's value. He was the clearest-headed, most rational centrist of that era. This book was never a collection of formulas written for experts, but a guide to how society works written for ordinary people. He breaks down the underlying rules governing the circulation of wealth and explains the essence of labor, capital relations, taxation, and the role of government. More than 170 years have passed, yet the core conclusions can still be directly applied today. In the book, Mill builds a complete economic system, divided into 5 major sections: how wealth is produced, and how output is distributed among the population, how goods circulate through exchange, what impact social progress will have on the economy, and what functional boundaries the government should hold to in the economy. Today we won't try to cover every aspect of the whole book, and we'll instead focus closely on the 3 real-world questions you care about most, to string together and fully explain Mill's core ideas. Where is the real way out for working people? What is the underlying standard for tax fairness? Where should the reasonable boundary of government intervention be drawn? Read on with these 3 questions in mind. You'll find that many of the controversies being argued about fiercely today already had their answers written in this old book long ago. Let's continue from the first core question raised at the start. When we've long been used to the default path of graduating and sending out resumes, starting a job and taking a paycheck, following the boss's umpire, and living off wages, hardly anyone stops to ask, the boss pays the money. Is an employment relationship where the boss pays and workers provide labor really something that's only natural and the only viable way to live? This is the default assumption we need to break first. In 19th century Britain, labor-capital tensions were so sharp they nearly tore society apart. Workers worked more than 10 hours a day, earning wages that were only just enough to scrape by, and still having to endure the factory owners' wanton exploitation. The mainstream view at the time was that workers had only 2 ways out: either silently endure exploitation or use violence to overthrow the existing order. But in Principles of Political Economy, Mill offered a third path that most people had overlooked: He didn't stand on the moral high ground of utopian socialism and shout slogans. Instead, based on real business practices that had already emerged at the time, he pointed out that workers could absolutely pool their own money and run things themselves, and distribute the profits themselves, using cooperatives to bypass the capitalists. Be your own master. This isn't a utopia on paper. It's a real-world model that a group of ordinary workers proved in the marketplace with hard-earned cash. And, in Mill's view, the most reliable and sustainable path for the working class to move up. The most classic example of this model is the Rochdale Pioneers, still held up as a benchmark by cooperatives around the world. In 1844, in the town of Rochdale near Manchester, England, 28 textile workers were living through their hardest days. Factory wages were so low they could barely support a family. Not only were prices high in the town's shops, they often shortchanged customers on weight and measure, selling adulterated food. The money workers earned through hard labor was squeezed by factory owners on the production end, and then skimmed off again by middlemen on the consumer end, with no way out. The 28 people scraped together a total of £28 as startup capital, equivalent to half a year's wages for a skilled worker at the time. They rented a small street-front shop of a little over 10 square meters in town, and opened a grocery store that sold only necessities like flour, butter, and sugar. They set a few rules that were simple yet highly disruptive. First, all goods were clearly priced, full weight and measure, and never counterfeit. Never make an unscrupulous profit margin. Second, the shop practiced democratic management. Each member, no matter how much they contributed, had only one vote, putting an end to letting those with more money call the shots. Third, all profits generated by the business would not end up in the pockets of a few individuals, but instead would be fully returned in proportion to each member's spending. In this way, the little shop relied on integrity and affordability, and quickly won the trust of the workers in the surrounding area. Its scale snowballed and grew bigger and bigger. In just a little over 10 years, they expanded from a single grocery store into a flour mill, a textile mill, and a shoe factory, and even built workers' housing, a public library, and a school for workers' children, forming a cooperative system that covered everything from production to consumption, and from making a living to everyday life. By the end of the 19th century, the Rochdale model had spread throughout Europe and grown to hundreds of thousands of members, giving rise to the International Cooperative Alliance, whose influence continues to this day. Its core logic, put plainly, isn't complicated at all. Bypass the capitalists who earn excessive profits. Cut out the middlemen who mark up prices at every level, so that those involved hold two identities at once, worker and owner. When you work at a factory, you're a worker who contributes labor, and at the same time, you're a member of the cooperative, a co-owner of the assets. In the end, the money you earn doesn't have to be split with unknown shareholders far away in London, nor do you have to support a bunch of top executives who don't directly create value. It's all distributed according to the rules to every participant. Workers no longer have to haggle with the boss in a tug of war over pay raises. Shops don't have to make profits by ripping off customers. Everyone's interests are tied together on the same boat. Many people think cooperatives can succeed because the workers are morally upright and have a spirit of collective dedication. But Muller sees it very clearly. The vitality of the cooperative system has never come from moral preaching, but from hard economic laws. It precisely solves two major chronic problems of the traditional wage employment system. The first major advantage is compressing wasted costs to the extreme, benefiting both producers and consumers. In the traditional private enterprise system, a product, from the factory to the consumer's hands, has its profits carved up layer by layer. At the top, shareholders want to take steady dividends year after year. Corporate executives want compensation dozens of times higher than ordinary employees. Multi-level distributors want to earn a markup at every stage. The brand also has to pour huge sums into marketing. These costs that don't directly contribute to production will ultimately all be added to the product's price and paid for by all consumers. And workers' wages are always the boss's first choice when it comes to cutting costs. The cooperative directly cuts out the huge chunk of capital's excess returns. There are no small group of shareholders sitting back and reaping the benefits. The management is elected by the members, and compensation is open and transparent, and far lower than executives at private companies of the same scale. The distribution chain is reduced and flattened. Nor is there any need to spend big money on advertising or building a brand. Word of mouth is the best promotion. Part of the money saved becomes lower product prices, so consumers benefit. The other part becomes higher pay for workers. Let workers take home more money. Historical records show that, at the same level of labor intensity, workers at the Rochdale factory could earn 30% more than those at ordinary factories, and prices at the cooperative's general goods store could be 20% cheaper than on the market. This is the most simple, most hardcore kind of market competitiveness. The second major advantage is defusing labor, capital antagonism at its root, turning an employee mindset into an owner's mindset. In traditional employment relationships, labor and capital are inherently in opposition. The boss wants to keep wages down and raise efficiency to earn more profit. Workers want to do less work and take home more pay to protect their rights and interests. Both sides are wary of each other. Workers slack off and coast to collect a paycheck. The boss keeps a close eye on performance reviews. The internal friction is enormous. Raises depend on strikes and negotiations, and layoffs trigger labor disputes. The whole society is paying extra costs for this kind of antagonism. But under a cooperative system, there is no opposition between bosses and employees. Everyone is both a worker and an owner. Whether you do more or less, whether you do well or poorly, will ultimately be directly reflected in your own dividends. Without dedicated supervisors, workers will still proactively improve efficiency. Without having to organize strikes, once performance improves, everyone naturally gets a larger share of the profits. The Rochdale factory operated for decades and never saw large-scale strikes, and there were rarely cases of people slacking off at work. It wasn't that the workers had higher moral consciousness. It was the institutional design that fully aligned individual interests with collective interests. Every slice of the bigger cake included a share for oneself. But what's most admirable about Mill is that he never touted the cooperative system as a cure-all, as the most clear-headed, rational centrist in classical economics. He pointed out, without pulling any punches, two inherent flaws of the cooperative system in his book. He even stated bluntly that it could never fully replace private enterprises. The first inherent flaw is that once it grows in scale, it can easily deteriorate, forgetting the original intention of cooperation. When a cooperative first gets started, everyone are fellow workers pooling money and working together with equal status, with aligned interests. But once the scale expands and it becomes necessary to hire more new employees, the conflict between ownership and status immediately becomes apparent. The early founding members already hold shares and dividend rights, becoming the old guard with vested interests. Newly hired employees often can only receive a fixed salary, with no member status and no share of the profits. Over time, the old members become, in effect, a shareholder class, earning returns off the labor of new employees. New employees are no different from ordinary factory workers. Muller specifically mentioned in the book that even the Manufacturing Association under the Rochdale pioneers later fell into this trap. The original 28 pioneers gradually became a privileged class, and the large number of workers hired afterward were unable to obtain member status and could only receive a fixed wage. In the end, the cooperative was warped into an ordinary business, owned by a few people and run by the labor of the many. In essence, it became no different from the capitalist factories he had opposed in the first place. This distortion of the original mission wasn't a moral slide on the part of individuals, but an inevitable governance problem that collective property rights run into after scaling up. The second inherent flaw is the low efficiency of collective decision-making and a lack of motivation to take risks and innovate. In private enterprises, the boss alone can make the call and decide if he spots a new technology or a new track. Even if the risk is high, as long as he thinks it's worth the bet, he can throw money at it and give it a try. If it succeeds, the gains are his. If it fails, he bears the losses himself. This decision-making mechanism may be arbitrary, and it even often makes mistakes. but it's extremely efficient and suits a rapidly changing market environment. But cooperatives operate on collective decision-making with one person, one vote. Most ordinary people's instinct is to play it safe, since if it fails, it's everyone's money that's lost, and no one is willing to step forward and take the risk. So cooperatives are often better at doing mature, stable businesses, like daily necessities retail and food processing. Yet it's hard for them to proactively pursue disruptive innovation. They don't dare invest in high-risk R&D, nor do they dare rashly break into entirely new fields. Over time, in industries with rapid technological iteration and fierce competition, cooperatives can easily be left behind by private enterprises that dare to take risks. And it's precisely for this reason that Muller's conclusion is very pragmatic. Private enterprises and cooperatives are not in a you die or I die substitute relationship, but rather a competitive relationship of coexistence and mutual complementarity. The existence of private enterprises, in turn, forces cooperatives not to just lie flat. They must maintain efficiency and keep pace with the market. The existence of cooperatives also sets a benchmark for how private enterprises treat workers. If the boss offers pay and benefits that are too poor and squeezes people too hard, workers can organize a cooperative themselves and start anew. This, in turn, forces private companies to improve workers' pay and benefits and optimize how income is distributed. The two models compete with each other in the market and correct each other. That actually makes things healthier than any single model. Viewed from today's perspective, Muller's judgment still hasn't become outdated. Many of the models we're used to seeing around us are, in essence, modern variations of the cooperative system. Employee stock ownership and stock option schemes at internet companies allow key employees to share in the profits of the company's growth. In essence, they use partial ownership to tie workers to the company, reducing antagonism between labor and management. Professional organizations such as law firms, accounting firms, and design studios commonly adopt a partner system. Everyone invests together, works together, and distributes returns according to contribution. This is the most typical kind of small cooperative. Even open-source software communities and small teams doing collective entrepreneurship follow the same underlying logic as the Rochdale pioneers. They don't rely on capital hiring labor. They create value through win-win cooperation among participants. Muller's prediction from 170 years ago still holds true today. The real way out for the working class has never been to use violence to strip others of their wealth, but to learn to organize themselves and learn to cooperate, step by step improving their own capabilities, gradually moving from selling only their labor power to also owning capital, peacefully and progressively enabling more people to share in the gains of economic growth. This is the safest and most sustainable path for social advancement. Having finished discussing the distribution relationship between workers and capital, let's look at the second core issue, one that directly affects everyone's wallet. The personal income tax and Social Security contributions deducted from us every month, and the various taxes and fees we quietly bear when we consume. By what standard should they be levied for it to count as fair? In his discussion of wealth distribution and the functions of government, Mill offered a set of criteria that still holds up to this day. Having finished discussing the distribution relationship between workers and capital, let's turn our attention to a more hidden gap in everyone's wallet: taxation. Personal income tax and Social Security deductions on your payslip quietly slip away. In everyday life, when you buy a bottle of water or a piece of clothing, the price also hides invisible taxes and fees. Almost everyone has complained that the tax burden is heavy and that paying taxes isn't fair. But few people can clearly explain what kind of taxation truly counts as fair. Is it really only natural and right that if you earn more, you should pay more? All right, let's break it down in 4 steps. 1. The ultimate standard: equal paying. First, let's ask the simplest question. One person has an annual income of $100,000, pays $10,000 in tax, and another person has an annual income of $1 million, pays $100,000 in tax. Both people's tax rate is 10%. The numbers are perfectly equal. Does that count as fair? Many people's first reaction is yes. Earn more, pay more. With the same proportion, that's the fairest. But Mill, in Principles of Political Economy, gave a completely different answer. This isn't fairness, it's only proportional equality, not true equality of sacrifice. The essence of taxation is that the state forcibly takes a portion of wealth from everyone. It brings inconvenience, a sense of loss, and a sense of sacrifice to everyone. Mill believed that the ultimate standard of tax fairness has never been numerical proportional equality. It is equality of sacrifice. After paying taxes, the degree of pain each person feels and the degree of loss in the utility of wealth should be the same. This is the root of the entire theory of taxation. All later disputes over the tax system are essentially all debates over how to make everyone's pain from paying taxes as equal as possible. The core logic here is the diminishing marginal utility of wealth. For an ordinary person with an annual income of 100,000, 10,000 yuan might be 3 months' rent or a family's food expenses. Taking away that 10,000 means having to directly cut back on basic living expenses. Quality of life will noticeably decline. The pain of the loss is very intense. But for someone with an annual income of 1 million, taking away 100,000 is nothing more than buying one less watch or canceling an overseas trip. Basic living is completely unaffected. The sense of satisfaction that wealth brings is hardly diminished. The pain is negligible. It's the same 10% proportion. But what the poor give up is a sacrifice at the level of survival, while what the rich give up is only a sacrifice at the level of enjoyment. The pain felt by the two is worlds apart. It can't be called fair at all. Mill laid down this underlying logic as far back as 170 years ago. To this day, tax system design in every country around the world still hasn't broken out of this core framework. 2. For basic rules. Before Mill, Adam Smith had long since put forward the famous 4 principles of taxation: equality, certainty, convenience, and the lowest possible cost of collection. In Principles of Political Economy, Mill comprehensively developed and revised these 4 principles, making them better suited to the social realities of the industrial era. Among them, the certainty of taxation means that the time, method, and amount of payment must be clearly defined and made public, and must not be arbitrarily manipulated by law enforcers so as to prevent rent seeking by those in power. Convenience means that the procedures and timing for paying taxes should be made as easy as possible for taxpayers. And ordinary people shouldn't have to run themselves ragged just to pay taxes, burning a huge amount of time. Low collection costs means keeping the labor and material resources consumed by the tax system as streamlined as possible, so you don't spend 80 yuan in costs to collect 100 yuan in taxes, causing pointless waste of society's resources. These 3 principles are hardly controversial. What has really been argued over for more than 200 years has always been the first one: equality. So what exactly is equality in taxation? Should the rich pay more or pay less? People with different positions can arrive at completely opposite conclusions, and Mill's answer remains highly impactful to this day. 3. The core dispute: should the rich pay more taxes? The rich should pay more taxes has, today, almost become the default consensus for many people. But Mill's view is far more nuanced and more level-headed than that statement. He drew a strict distinction between wealth from different sources and adopted completely different attitudes toward them. He explicitly opposed progressive income tax and strongly supported progressive inheritance tax, while also holding the line that money needed to stay alive should not be taxed. First, Muller explicitly opposed a progressive tax system on individuals' labor income. That is, the higher the income, the more the income tax rate rises step by step. In his view, this was not only unfair, but would instead harm society's long-term interests as a whole. His core reasoning was very straightforward. The vast majority of high incomes are essentially the reward for diligence, frugality, and risk-taking. Someone works harder than others and puts in more hours, is more willing to live frugally and accumulate capital, and is more willing to bear the risks of starting a business. Only then do they earn a higher income. Levying a higher progressive tax on the high-income portion is equivalent to directly punishing diligence, frugality, and a spirit of risk-taking. The harder you work and the more you can earn, the higher the percentage the state takes. It's as if the returns on your hard work are discounted again and again. Over time, People will lose the motivation to work more and earn more. Since most of what you earn beyond a certain point gets taken away anyway, you might as well work less and rest more. When everyone is no longer willing to work themselves to the bone to create wealth, the whole society's pie will keep getting smaller and smaller. In the end, everyone will become poorer, including the poor. It should be noted that Muller is not arguing that the rich shouldn't pay more taxes. He agrees that people with higher incomes should pay more tax. But he believes the reasonable approach is a flat tax plus a tax-free allowance, rather than a progressive tax where the rate increases step by step. As long as the income needed to maintain basic living is fully tax-exempt, and the portion above that is taxed at a uniform rate, that in itself already achieves having the rich pay more tax, while at the same time not dampening the incentive to create wealth. But on another matter, Mill was a firm supporter of progressive taxation, namely, the inheritance tax. He not only supported levying an inheritance tax, but also explicitly argued that the inheritance tax should use progressive rates. The larger the inheritance, the higher the tax rate. Mill's logic was very clear. Earned income and unearned gains are two completely different things. Money earned through one's own hands and mind is the result of personal effort. The state should protect it and should not tax it excessively. Otherwise, it will discourage hard work. But a large inheritance acquired through blood ties has nothing to do with the heir's diligence or ability. It is purely the product of luck. Taxing this portion of wealth more heavily will not dampen anyone's motivation to work. No one will choose not to work hard just because they'll have to pay tax on an inheritance they may receive in the future. More importantly, the intergenerational transfer of large fortunes will cause serious inequality of opportunity. If people born into wealthy families can live in luxury for their whole lives without having to work, then no matter how hard people born into ordinary families try, it will be difficult for them to catch up. Society's class structure will become completely rigid. The meaning of striving will be undermined. In Mill's view, limiting the inheritance of large estates is essentially about safeguarding equality of opportunity. What society should encourage is becoming wealthy through one's own efforts, not becoming wealthy by being born into the right family. Levy a progressive tax on inheritances. Take a portion of the unearned wealth and give it back to society to improve public services and create more opportunities for ordinary people. This not only accords with the principle of equal sacrifice, but also won't harm society's incentive to create wealth, is one of the most reasonable types of tax. No matter how the tax system is designed, Mill drew an untouchable bottom line. Money needed to maintain basic survival must never be taxed. The so-called life-saving money is the minimum income necessary for a person to maintain basic food, clothing, housing, and transportation and ensure a normal life. If what a person earns in a year is just enough to eat, pay rent, and see a doctor, barely scraping by, and the state still has to withhold taxes from it, that is tantamount to directly depriving people of their basic right to survive. Taxing this part of income brings an infinitely great sense of sacrifice and pain to the poor. It may mean the children can't afford to go to school and the family can't afford medical care, or even can't get enough to eat. But for the rich, this little bit of money is something they don't feel at all. This is the most extreme unfairness. It completely violates the basic principles of taxation. The origin of the personal income tax threshold we're familiar with today comes from this very logic. First, subtract the costs everyone needs to maintain basic living, and then tax the portion that exceeds the minimum living expenses. This is to uphold the bottom line of not reaching for people's life-sustaining money. This is also the shared consensus underlying the tax systems of all modern civilized countries. 4. Direct taxes versus indirect taxes, which is more conscientious. Once we understand the underlying standards of tax fairness, let's look at a real-world question that concerns everyone. Between direct taxes that are deducted openly and indirect taxes hidden in prices, which is actually more reasonable? So-called direct taxes are taxes that take money straight out of your pocket. The most typical examples are personal income tax and property tax. Their defining feature is that the taxpayer is the one who actually bears the tax burden. The money goes directly from your hands to the state, crystal clear. Plain as day. The benefits of direct taxes are very obvious, because the pain of paying taxes is very direct. Everyone knows exactly how much they paid. Naturally, they'll care about where the government spent the money, and whether it was money well spent. This will in turn force the government to use fiscal funds more responsibly. But its drawbacks are also quite prominent. It's difficult to collect. Underreporting and non-reporting are likely to occur, requiring strong tax administration and collection capacity. The cost of tax collection is relatively higher. So-called indirect taxes. They are taxes embedded in the prices of goods and services. For example, value-added tax and consumption tax. When you buy a bottle of mineral water, a piece of clothing, or a meal, you've already paid the tax at the time of payment, but you don't notice it at all. Merchants may appear to be the taxpayers, but in reality they add the tax into the price, and in the end it is all borne by consumers. The biggest advantage of indirect taxes is that they're easy to collect, and there's almost no way to evade them. Taxes are attached to every single product, collected layer by layer along the chain of production and circulation, without needing to keep tabs on each person's income one by one. The administrative cost is extremely low, but indirect taxes have a fatal flaw. They are inherently unfriendly to the poor and strongly regressive. The lower a person's income, the heavier the tax burden they end up bearing. Why is that? Because poor people have to spend almost all of their income on consumption. Buying rice, buying flour, paying rent. Every single cent has to be spent on life's necessities, which means that indirect taxes are levied on almost all of their income, whereas only a small portion of rich people's income is used for everyday consumption, with most of their money going into savings, investment, and buying assets. This portion of money doesn't bear indirect taxes. When you do the math, the proportion of income that poor people pay in taxes is far higher than that of the rich. For example, someone with an annual income of 50,000 yuan spends all their money. Assuming the average indirect tax rate is 10%, they pay 5,000 yuan in taxes a year, which is 10% of their income. Someone with an annual income of 5 million yuan spends 500,000 yuan a year. At the same 10% tax rate, they pay 50,000 yuan in taxes. That's only 1% of their income. The poorer someone is, the higher the share of their income taken up by taxes, and the stronger the pain they feel. This completely goes against the principle of equal sacrifice. It is precisely because he clearly saw the regressivity of indirect taxes that Mill arrived at a very clear conclusion. An ideal tax system should be centered on direct taxes, and indirect taxes should be levied only on luxury goods. Under no circumstances should heavy taxes be imposed on basic necessities. In his view, levying indirect taxes on basic necessities such as rice, flour, salt, and ordinary clothing is, in essence, a targeted squeeze on the poor. These are goods that everyone has to buy, and the poor spend the largest share of their consumption on them. Add even a little tax. The poor's living pressure increases a bit more, while the rich hardly feel it at all. This kind of tax is the easiest and most discreet to collect, but it's also the most unfair, classic picking on the softest target. Conversely, it's much more reasonable to levy indirect taxes on luxury goods like high-end cosmetics, designer bags, luxury cars, and mansions. After all, only the rich buy these things in the first place. Collecting a bit more tax won't affect anyone's basic survival. The rich won't feel much pain either, which aligns with equal sacrifice. And it can also help regulate income. It's convenient to collect as well. At this point, Miller's tax logic is actually already very clear. To judge whether a tax is good or not, and whether it's fair, there's no need to drag in complicated theories. Just look at 3 criteria. First, does it undermine the incentive to work hard and create wealth? Second, does it bully the poor? Will it make people at the bottom bear a heavier burden of pain? Third, are the collection costs high or not? Will it waste a huge amount of social resources? Apply these 3 criteria. Then we can understand many controversies at a glance. A progressive income tax strikes at diligent work and creation. It fails the first criterion, so Mill opposed it. A progressive inheritance tax does not undermine diligence. It can also curb unearned gains and promote fairness, and it's not hard to levy either. So Mill supported it. Indirect taxes on basic necessities precisely pick on the poor. It fails the second criterion, so Mill opposed it. Indirect taxes on luxury goods don't pick on the poor, and they're easy to collect, so they can be kept. The three standards may seem simple, but they lay out the underlying logic of tax fairness with complete clarity. The essence of taxation is the consideration the public pays the government in exchange for public services. Once we've figured out how taxes should be collected to be fair, we'll naturally go on to ask the next, even more fundamental question. What exactly should the government do with the taxes we pay? Which matters are the government's non-negotiable responsibilities? And which are overstepping its bounds, pointless meddling? Where, exactly, should the boundaries of government power be drawn? This is precisely the central issue Mill focuses on in the final part of the book. It is also the third question that is closely tied to every one of our lives, work, and entrepreneurship. Once we understand how taxes should be levied fairly, we will naturally press on to a more fundamental question. After the government takes away the wealth we pay in, what exactly should it manage, and what areas should it let go of? From industry regulation to market intervention, from livelihood baojong to industry support. We often complain on the one hand that the government meddles too much, stifling market vitality, while on the other hand, when problems arise, we accuse the government of absent regulation and of failing to fulfill its responsibilities. Where exactly should the boundary between the government and the market be drawn? This question, debated for centuries, was given a set of clear judgment criteria by Mill in Principles of Political Economy, criteria that remain applicable to this day. 1. The basic stance, by default, don't meddle. The underlying tone of Mill's thought is a firm principle of laissez-faire. Anything that individuals can do themselves and take responsibility for, the government should not step in or do it on their behalf. But it must be emphasized that he was by no means a rigid market fundamentalist, nor an extreme libertarian who argues that the smaller the government, the better. His laissez-faire approach had preconditions and boundaries. Non-intervention was the default principle and the starting point for thinking about issues. And intervention had to be the exception. Every instance of government intervention had to have sufficient, strict justification, with rigorous weighing of pros and cons, never based on subjective will, reaching out and intervening casually on the basis of moral impulse. This stance was fully consistent with his long-standing, rational centrist character. He neither believed the government was an all-knowing, all-powerful force for good, nor that the market was a flawless god. He acknowledged that there are times when the market fails. He also acknowledged that the government has responsibilities it must take on. But what he was more wary of was the unlimited expansion of government power. Because once power reaches out, it is very hard to pull it back in again. And the harm it ultimately brings is often greater than the problem he wanted to solve. 2. Why is the default that it shouldn't intervene? 3 core reasons. The reason Mill took non-intervention as the first principle was not out of blind worship of the market, but rather based on 3 real-world logics that build on one another step by step, each of which points directly to the inherent flaws of government intervention. The first reason is also the most intuitive. The parties involved will always understand their own interests better than the government. What kind of job a person does, what small shop they open, how they arrange their income and their life. They will always be the clearest about the risks, returns, and difficulties involved. Officials in administrative agencies far away, separated by layers of information gaps, neither understand each individual's specific situation, nor can they predict the long-term consequences of every choice. Top-down regulation is essentially using the judgment of a few to replace the independent choices of tens of millions. The result is often one-size-fits-all policies that are out of touch with reality. Good intentions end up doing harm. For example, requiring small vendors to set up their stalls according to uniform standards, and requiring self-employed businesses to go through cumbersome approval procedures, seemingly standardized, but in fact wiping out the flexibility and survival savvy of individuals. In the end, it actually leaves many people without a way to make a living. The second reason, the more the government manages, the greater the side effects. Ultimately, the cost of regulation is often far higher than the problem itself. With every additional regulation comes another set of approval procedures, another group of regulators, and another administrative expense. The operating costs of society will rise accordingly. More importantly, where power is concentrated, rent-seeking opportunities will inevitably arise. The more regulations there are, and the stricter the approvals, the more likely it is that money power deals and backroom manipulation will occur. In the end, the ones who truly benefit are not ordinary people, but the small minority close to power. Many times, in order to solve a small problem, the government introduces a regulation, and the resulting side effects, corruption, inefficiency, rigidity, and the like, end up doing far more harm than the original problem. A typical case where the medicine does more harm to the body than the illness itself. The third reason is also the most fundamental and the easiest to overlook. A nation's ability to stand on its own is forged in the process of solving its own problems, not arranged by the government. If everything is ultimately covered by the government and solved through policy, the public will gradually lose the ability to make independent judgments, act independently, and take risks on their own. They become dependent, lazy, and afraid to try. A society's vitality is never planned from the top down. It is carved out bit by bit through the independent attempts and trial and error of countless ordinary people. From as small as an individual's skills for making a living, to as large as the entire society's capacity for innovation. It can only grow in an environment where people are responsible for themselves. Mill saw far into the future, when the government intervenes excessively. In the short term, it may spare the public some trouble, but in the long term, it is crippling a whole nation's ability to survive and its creative vitality. This is the most fatal cost. 3. 5 situations that must be regulated. Of course, Mill never said the government shouldn't manage anything at all. On the contrary, in the book, he clearly listed 5 categories of situations in which government intervention is justified. Each one has strict logical support. Even when applied to today, more than 170 years later, it's not outdated in the slightest. On the contrary, it remains a core yardstick for judging whether government actions are reasonable. The first is in areas where consumers themselves can't tell good from bad. The government must regulate. For many goods and services, ordinary people don't have the professional ability to judge. By the time they rely on trial and error to find out what's good or bad, the harm has already been done. For example, with medicines, ordinary people can't tell whether the ingredients are effective or whether there are toxic side effects. For example, with education, it's hard for parents to accurately judge a teacher's professional competence and whether the teaching content complies with regulations. For example, with food safety, consumers can't tell whether ingredients have spoiled or whether there are illegal additives. In these fields where information is severely asymmetric, relying on free market competition and having consumers vote with their feet doesn't work. The cost of trial and error is simply too high. At that point, the government steps in to set industry standards, review professional qualifications, and carry out routine oversight. In essence, this isn't about restricting freedom, but about helping ordinary people avoid trial and error risks they can't afford to bear. Make up for market failures caused by information gaps. Today's drug regulation, teacher qualification certification, and random spot checks for food safety essentially all fall under this kind of justified intervention. This is the bottom line the government must uphold. The second type is protecting groups that have no ability to protect themselves. The government must step in. The premise of laissez-faire is that all participants have independent, rational judgment and can take responsibility for their own choices. But in society, there are always some people who do not have full self-protection capabilities and can't engage in equal bargaining with others. The most typical examples are children and minors. Their minds are not yet mature. They can neither judge how harmful a job is to them, nor negotiate with employers. If the market is left completely unchecked, there will be widespread exploitation of child labor. So the government legislated to ban child labor and enforce compulsory education. Protecting minors from abuse is a self-evident responsibility. But on this issue, Mill had a very forward-looking view. Women do not belong to a group that needs special protection. In 19th century Europe, women were generally seen as the weaker sex. Many people argued that the government should introduce special policies to protect women. But Mill explicitly opposed this. He believed that as long as women are granted completely equal rights with men, equal educational opportunities, and an equal position in the marketplace, they are fully capable of protecting themselves. Treating women as inherently weak and in need of extra government care is, in essence, a form of discrimination, and would instead entrench women's disadvantaged position. This viewpoint is still deafeningly powerful even today. True equality is equality of rights, not special preferential treatment. Besides that, Mill even believed that the protection of animals also falls into this category. Animals do not have the ability to protect themselves, nor can they speak up for themselves. Banning cruel abuse of animals is a responsibility that the government of a civilized society ought to fulfill. The third type is cases where individual rationality leads to collective irrationality. The government must step in. Some things, from an individual's perspective, are a rational, optimal choice. But if everyone does that, in the end it will harm everyone's interests. This is what we often call the prisoner's dilemma. The market alone can't break this deadlock. It has to be the government stepping in to set rules and force everyone to follow them. The most typical example is working hours. If an individual worker refuses to work overtime, they may be replaced by someone willing to work overtime and lose their job. So from an individual's perspective, choosing to work overtime is a rational form of self-protection. But when everyone is forced to work overtime, it creates a vicious cycle of overcompetition. Everyone's working hours get longer and longer, and their rest time gets less and less. Yet overall wages don't go up. Everyone ends up worse off. At this point, the government introduces laws to limit the maximum working hours and mandates compensation for overtime. It's essentially drawing a single, uniform line for everyone. Everyone reduces overtime together, and no one will lose their job because of it. Overall welfare actually improves. Besides that, environmental protection and the protection of public resources follow the same logic. For a company, discharging pollutants to lower its own costs is an individually rational choice. But if all companies do it, the environment will deteriorate completely, and everyone will suffer together. For fishermen, catching more fish to earn more money is individually rational. But if everyone overfishes, fishery resources will be depleted, and in the end, no one will have any fish left to catch. These tragedies of the commons can never be solved through spontaneous market adjustment. They must be addressed through government legislation and regulation, clearly defining rights and responsibilities, so as to safeguard the collective's long-term interests. The fourth type. When private actors do things that aren't profitable but are crucial to society as a whole, the government must step in. There's a category of things called public goods. It's essential to the development of society as a whole. But because you can't charge people in an exclusive way and the investment payback period is too long, private companies can't make money from doing it, so no one is willing to do it. The most classic example is a lighthouse. Building a lighthouse can guide the way for all passing ships, but you can't stop ships that don't pay from using it. If a private party builds a lighthouse, there's simply no way to recoup the costs, so no one is willing to build one. But shipping can't do without lighthouses. At that point, the government has to step in, build and maintain them with public funds. Besides traditional public goods like lighthouses, roads, and municipal facilities, basic scientific research is also a classic example. Breakthroughs in fundamental theory are the source of all technological innovation, but in themselves they have no direct commercial value. When companies invest money and can't see short-term returns, they naturally aren't willing to put money in. But a country's long-term competitiveness is rooted precisely in basic research. At this point, it is entirely legitimate for the government to fund and support universities and research institutes to do basic research. The breakthroughs in so-called choke point technologies we often talk about today, many of their roots lie in basic research. This is exactly where the government should step up. The fifth is to secure a basic survival floor for the poor, but it must never end up supporting idlers. Mill didn't believe that poverty could be solved entirely through private charity. Charity is random and unstable, and its coverage is also limited. A civilized society should ensure that none of its members end up in utter despair. Therefore, the government has a responsibility to establish a unified social assistance system, to provide a minimum living guarantee for those who have lost the ability to work and fallen into survival difficulties. This is society's bottom line. But at the same time, Mill drew an unshakable iron rule. The living standard provided through relief must be lower than the minimum income level of workers who support themselves through their own labor. In other words, living on relief must always be worse than going to work and earning a living. Once the relief standard is too high, it makes people feel that they can live quite well without working. More and more people will give up work and live on relief. This will not only drag down public finances, but also destroy these people's willingness to work and their ability to be self-reliant. In the end, it creates a permanent underclass, and instead exacerbates social problems. A safety net is meant to help people get through hard times, not to let them lie flat and become dependent. Once you fail to strike the right balance, a good thing can turn into a bad one. Having covered what should be regulated, Muller also harshly criticizes in the book many misguided interventions that seem reasonable but are actually harmful. These negative examples from more than 100 years ago still carry a powerful warning for today. For example, imposing high tariffs to protect domestic industries. Many people think that taxing foreign goods heavily will give domestic companies room to survive and workers won't lose their jobs. But Muller incisively points out, in essence, this makes all consumers nationwide pick up the tab for a handful of industries. Tariffs drive up the prices of imported goods, and comparable domestic products will also be sold at higher prices. Every ordinary person has to spend more money when buying things. It's equivalent to the whole population subsidizing the practitioners in a small number of industries. In the long run, the protected industries lose competitive pressure and become less and less efficient, more and more backward. In the end, they actually lose international competitiveness. The whole society has to pay the price for this kind of protection. For example, setting an upper limit on usury interest rates. Many people think that capping the maximum interest rate can prevent the poor from being exploited by usurious loans. But in reality, it's exactly the opposite. Lending money to the poor is inherently risky. If the law stipulates that the interest rate cannot exceed a certain level, lenders will feel that the returns can't cover the risk. They'll simply stop lending to the poor altogether. In the end, the poor instead can't borrow legitimate money. They can only turn to the underground black market and bear even higher interest and harsher collection practices. Their situation ends up worse. The original intention was to help the poor, but the result ends up hurting the poor instead. Then there's the most common price control, thinking something is too expensive, and forcibly setting a maximum price. It looks like it's made things cheaper, but merchants feel they can't make money selling at that price. So they'll reduce production and cut supply. In the end, severe shortages appear in the market. Ordinary people can't buy things even if they have money. Instead, it gives rise to chaos like black markets, queuing, and pulling strings through connections. The original intention of price caps is to make things affordable for everyone, but the result is that nobody can buy them. The essence of these misguided interventions is the same. They only see the short-term, superficial effects of the policy, but overlook that people's behavior will change in response to the policy. And even more so, they overlook the underlying logic of economic laws. Intervention that runs counter to those laws, no matter how good the original intention, no matter how strong the sense of morality, the end result is bound to go against one's wishes. It may even be worse than doing nothing. Once we clarify what the government should manage and what it shouldn't, we also connect the complete thread of Mill's entire economic system, from the laws governing the production of wealth to the fair principles of distribution, and then to the market logic of exchange, from the long-term impact of social progress, ultimately landing on the boundaries of government functions. The reason this theory, born 170 years ago, has been able to transcend time and still remain vibrant. The key lies in the fact that it doesn't blindly follow any stance, but always makes judgments based on the underlying logic of human nature and how society operates. So, looking at today's reality, how should ordinary people make good use of Mill's ideas? What concrete, actionable insights does this old book still offer us today? This is what we'll sort out in our final section. After going through Mill's full set of reflections on labor, capital relations, tax fairness, and the boundaries of government, what ultimately remains are three clear understandings that can pierce through the fog of reality. And they are also the most precious intellectual legacy this 170-year-old book has left to people today. First, social issues have never had clear-cut, black and white standard answers. Neither put blind faith in the market as an all-purpose cure, nor put blind faith that the government is always right. When many people discuss public issues, they easily tend to slide into extreme polarization, so that if they champion the market, they can't tolerate even the slightest regulation. If they support the government, they hope everything will be taken care of by policy. But from beginning to end, Mill refused to take sides. He recognized the market's efficiency and vitality, and also confronted the market's blind spots and unfairness head-on. He acknowledged the government's public responsibilities, and also stayed alert to the side effects of expanding power and the risk of rigidity. Deciding whether something should be left alone or regulated has never been about which ideology it aligns with, but about holding fast to one core yardstick. In the end, can this make ordinary people more capable and more self-reliant, rather than more dependent and more passive? If it meets this standard, it's a good system. If it violates this standard, no matter how pleasant the slogans sound, in the end it will still become distorted. Second, the fundamental driving force of social progress is forever anchored in ordinary people themselves. It doesn't rely on capitalists suddenly being kind-hearted and voluntarily giving up profits, nor does it rely on the government taking on everything and handling it all. The reason Mill advocated the cooperative system was not because it is morally more lofty, but because it enables workers to change their circumstances through their own capacity for organization. The reason he was wary of excessive relief was not that he lacked sympathy for the weak, but because he knew well that what truly enables people to get out of trouble is the ability to stand on their own feet, not ongoing handouts. The sign of a society getting better has never been how many people are supported by others, but that more and more people learn to cooperate, learn to make rational judgments, and learn to take responsibility for their own choices. For every inch that ordinary people's capabilities grow, society's civilization advances an inch. Third, economics has never been a discipline concerned only with money, but a discipline about people's choices. What Mill talks about in his book, Production, Distribution, Exchange, and the Functions of Government, on the surface seems to be the laws governing the flow of wealth, but at its core is a profound insight into human nature, human behavior, and long-term well-being. More than 170 years have passed, and technology has iterated. Industries have upgraded, and the social order has been turned upside down. But the underlying logic of human nature hasn't changed. The eternal tensions between the individual and the collective, fairness and efficiency, freedom and boundaries still remain. The reason Mill's thinking still has vitality to this day is precisely because it always stays anchored in people themselves, rather than being confined to the specific conclusions of any one era. At the end of the day, reading century-old classics has never been about flaunting your learning or quoting famous lines. It's in the present moment, when opinions clash and extreme views are flying everywhere, put a steady measuring stick into your own mind. Once you see the underlying logic clearly, you won't be swept along by emotions, and you won't be led astray by slogans. You'll be able to hold on to your own settled views amid complicated, tangled social issues, and make clearer-headed judgments. All right, that's all we'll discuss about this book. I hope this has been inspiring to you. I'm really happy to have spent the time of another book with you. I'm Uncle Da, reading slower books in a fast-paced world. See you with the next book.